Hey there, Acid Horizon listeners, this is Craig. This month on our Patreon page, we are doing a seminar on Foucault's essay, The Analytic Philosophy of Politics. We would like you to join us. How do you do that? Well, you become a mid-tier subscriber or higher on our Patreon page. Just want to say thank you to everybody who supported so far, whether that's through purchasing merch at our Crit Drip merch store, or becoming a patron, or just being friends with us on Twitter and hanging out. We take your feedback seriously, and we use your interest to help develop our episodes. So go ahead and connect with us through any of the links that you see in the show notes, wherever you're listening. Today, we are looking at Friedrich Nietzsche's The Genealogy of Morals, the second essay. This book and this essay are a particular favorite among many of us here on the show, so let's check it out. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Craig here, along with Will, Matt, and Adam, to discuss the second essay of Friedrich Nietzsche's on the Genealogy of Morals. Just to give you a heads up of the structure and purpose of the book as a whole, Nietzsche's project is to provide us with a kind of developmental history of the key values of morality as such. To do so, he splits his investigation across 3 essays, which we can summarize as each taking the origins of certain kinds of value inherent in the moral mode of thinking. The first essay focuses on the concept of good and evil as dichotomy. The third essay focuses on the concept of selflessness that realizes itself in the asceticism of moral thinking. And the second essay, our focus today, focuses on the concept of responsibility. To bring responsibility under the knife, Nietzsche focuses on a paradigm case of morality playing itself out on a field of responsibility, on the levels of both being responsible and acting responsibly. This paradigm case is the promise. So, to account for the origins of the moral value of responsibility, Nietzsche asks us, what kind of animal can make promises? What are the conditions of possibility that make any promise reliable, such that promising as a practice could survive?
This essay is methodologically really quite fascinating because it has all of the hallmarks of a kind of transcendental deduction. But rather than going for presuppositions in the more abstract and logical sense of, what do we need to presuppose to have these kinds of possibility of experiences, rather than possibility, it's explaining really the conditions for survival, the conditions of reality of certain kinds of moral concepts. This is why it's a genealogy, how did this thing survive enough to reproduce itself in these different forms and then get here? The key element to really refining the capacity of the human being to promise is primarily to do with memory and to defeat the most key aspect of our consciousness at first, which is forgetting. Because we are conscious of things all the time, and if we didn't forget them, we would never be fully done thinking about them. We have to let things pass in and out of the conscious shield. We need to sort of separate what content is relevant for us. We have active forgetting all of the time. Now, this is the force that's already operating us anyway. But memory is the faculty that actively holds on to those things that pass in this counter-flow of forgetting. And it's about training memory to properly grasp what is worth remembering, what is worth holding on to. And promising is a great way of doing this because, well, it's a great paradigm case for exploring the development of these forces. Because in order to get the capacity to promise, one needs a strong memory to remember what one promised to do. And not only that, one has to have a sense of the relation between the promise and the realization of it, and your capacity to will that promise into being. So you need concepts of causality, regularity, causal necessity, in order to promise in the first place, in order how to remember that promise and enact it later. And of course, overlaying all of this is a thick layer of desire. Desire that keeps memory active to realize it in the future. We have these basic, almost transcendental, but really historical conditions of possibility. How do we breed an animal that does this? How do we strengthen these forces of memory against forgetting, which is so natural to us in passing through our consciousness? And how do we inculcate the human being, these ideas of, how do we impregnate the human being with these ideas of regularity, causality, necessity? And what are the social conditions and even the physical, psychological conditions that will allow these to occur, to be brought about in such a high level that I can say, I promise to do this on X date, and I can be believed. And I can even be able to do that myself, not even if I can be believed to do it, in terms of being trustworthy, but also my very capacity to hold on to that promise, to remember that desire, to hold on to it and then enact it through a force of will, and even conceptualize that within my own mind.
One part of the answer for Nietzsche here, the question that, Nietzsche's raising and Adam is sort of explaining here for us. One part of the answer is that it's created at least partially through cruelty, through violence, through the spilling of blood. It's a violent origin for memory, for promise keeping, and therefore for morality. And one of the things I couldn't help but think as I was reading through this again, because I haven't read this essay in a few years now, is that there's so many parallels with chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus as well. Because in there, Deleuze and Guattari draw on anthropological and ethnographic research to discuss the role that inscriptions, ritual scarrings, burnings, etc., the sort of roles that they performed or functioned as in certain quote unquote primitive societies as they call them. So the important thing there for me is that Nietzsche says that this isn't just a hypothetical. It's not just that this is a useful thought experiment for thinking through the origins of morality, at least not as I read it. He's saying that there must have been, or there was, a moment of human history in which violence and pain was used essentially to inscribe upon bodies and to therefore create memories, to kind of discipline people to remember. I think there's a sentence where he says, even if they just remember a few basic rules and laws, etc., then memory can start to get off the ground and provides the conditions for the development of this thing we now call morals.
Yeah, the stimulant of an active memory, thinking about memory in the sense of a muscle, is the constant stress of pain, which breaks it down and forces it to push itself even further forward to remember better. Otherwise, the brand comes down. And then you could even see a bit of a Darwinian natural selection to this, although I'm not too sure how much Darwin is factoring in here.
It's quite Freudian as well. I mean, there's this view that Freud thought that like all of the things we experience get stored in our brain if only we could retrieve them, and that's not what Freud thinks. Like certain traumatic elements, do get sort of repressed and sublimated in the unconscious, etc. Sure, but the brain does have a sort of active screening effect. Like there's all sorts of things we just don't register and don't take in. And Nietzsche, at least on my reading, I'm wrong here, correct me, but it seems like Nietzsche has a similar view. It's that memory, at least at a certain point in human history, just filtered out pretty much everything, right? Like so much stuff just filters it out, and to extent still does, but only to the extent that these processes have not yet been, if they haven't been entirely successful, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, just to round off and let someone else, but I just wanted to clarify just on that point. It's not that memory's filtering things out. It's that there's a countervailing force of forgetting, which memory hasn't quite been built up enough to really fight against.
Forgetfulness is an active force within the psyche. It's a force that pushes back against it, yeah.
As far as active forgetting and Freud is concerned, he kind of picks that concept up with the notion of screen memories. And it's interesting because it's not only traumatic experiences that get screened out, it's also a lot of banal, everyday, ordinary content that goes in just to make life more livable in some sense. I mean, that's one of the things that Nietzsche says right off the bat here in the beginning is the function of forgetting is so that we can retain liveliness in our own lives. One addition that I would make to Adam's introductory explication is that with the creation of the kind of person who can promise, and with the primacy of memory, we also get the creation of a phenomenological sense, which is our sense of temporality and futurity, which in other words is the creation of a past and future for ourselves, right? That the past and the future has some relative sense of fixity. And just picking up the thread of Anti-Oedipus for a moment, it might be important to talk about the ontology that's created with the trumping of the faculty of active forgetting by memory. The idea that there's this I, an E-Y-E-I, that is created in virtue of the creation of the kind of person who can promise. One of the many functions of this I is to subordinate the person who can promise, to hold them to account. And when the subject is unable to fulfill their duties or act responsibly, the I arrogates to itself the ability to administer punishments and extract a surplus in the observation of those acts of punishment. And so what develops is this whole libidinal economy around the person who can promise, duty, responsibility, perpetual guilt. And we'll get into all of that. There's a lot of work to do before we get there, but early on, Nietzsche's already kind of laying out this roadmap of what Adam has called a transcendental deduction of Nietzsche's historical materialism. In any case, it's definitely worth looking at that section in chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus. It's section 5 on territorial representation, because Deleuze and Guattari really flesh out in their own way the argument that Nietzsche's developing in this essay.
Yeah, I mean, like when Matt was talking, I opened to literally that same passage of my Penguin edition. I think too here it's going to be really important that we talk about how the fundamental problem for if we're going to try to create some sort of overarching notion of the creditor here that's going to change form, is that it's always going to come down to like the burning and branding of bodies, the forging of alliances and debts that can and must, but also cannot be paid back. In a sense, like when you're talking about the creditor-debtor relationship, all of Nietzsche's various tendencies and focuses of his work, whether it be the life denial that he finds in the work of Socrates, where it's reasonable for one to say that the best thing is to have never been born and the next best thing is to die as soon as possible, to the notion of eternal recurrence, right? Because for Nietzsche here, the notion of this individual that can go beyond, that can go over these things, right, must see cosmological truth in the doctrine of the eternal return, right? This essay ends with enough, read Zarathustra, right? So really all of these social tendencies to Nietzsche all find themselves with such intensity, such remarkable potency in the social straitjacket that needed to be constructed in order to make the human being a creature that could remember, a creature that could be responsible for something.
Maybe we should say more about the creditor-debtor relationship too, because we just kind of thrust that in here and why that's important to Nietzsche.
Nietzsche articulates that in the sort of process of development, one of the things that human beings have always done, in fact, he kind of says that it might be one of the natural functions of their psyche, is to create kind of equivalences, right? Certain value judgments about what things are worth. So he's going to argue that even the most complicated systems of justice come down to, even I think the legal subject itself refers back to buying, selling, bartering, trade, and all of these things. The creditor and the debtor has a sort of central role even in things as old as like the Roman Code. But what's going to be important to Nietzsche is the pleasure that the creditor must take out in receiving repayment and compensation. In the early parts of this, in the anthropological elements of this text, there is a sort of physical compensation. There are the rights of the master, but there are also these other elements that come in as well, which is seeing the debtor despised and maltreated. So there's a sort of surplus enjoyment. So in this sort of realm or milieu of obligations, the moral concept of debt or of duty throughout history has always been the result of, and the famous quote is, a prolonged bloodletting. So I think that if we are to understand one thing from Nietzsche, one of the things that he's going to sort of wag a weary finger at is going to be the way in which we look at cruelty. And he's going to say that it's been intellectualized. We've injected it into a discourse about juridical morality and all of these things, when in reality, it's always been a sort of more base and fundamental element of human experience, and now modern man has a sort of new relationship to it.
I just wanted to explain to an extent sort of where we have reached with the creditor-debtor relationship as such. And one way to help direct development of this creditor-debtor relationship is to return to a bit slightly earlier in the text, where he's not simply hypothesizing about promising in general. Like, he's talking about the arrival on the scene of a particular kind of promising, the strongest form of promising that we have to date. And this is what he likes to talk about with the sovereign individual. So the sovereign individual is a notion for him of this fully autonomous moral agent who is self-legislating, fully, in touch with their will force themselves, conduct all their promises, and be a good little boy. This is essentially Kant. Kant's self-legislating moral legislator who is almost possessed by the moral law and wants to legislate themselves with their own maxims to, carry out a fully autonomous mode of promising, of legislating. Because, of course, in the groundwork, as well as thinking in a second critique as well, promising is one of the paradigm cases of Kant. When it comes to universalization, we couldn't universalize breaking promises, so it can never be a moral law. Promising you could easily universalize in some sense. Well, at least not break. Well, if you can't universalize breaking them, it's going to be hard to do promising in general. No Kant scholars get mad at me, please. But in order to understand this, I mean, you need an extra organ, because you do not get the sovereign individual. You don't really get Kant without, just from the creditor-debtor relationship purely. Because the creditor-debtor relationship is good at ensuring that some people may repay their promises unless, you may take your pound of flesh or so, for example. Or you get beaten or ostracized. But really that's seen as, there's nothing moral about that as such. It could just be a misfortune that you didn't have enough arete to escape detection from your debtors, or your debtors simply didn't forgive you. What you need is an internal motor, an internal kind of cruelty. So even if you got away from the master, you still felt guilt. Even if you got away from the creditor, you still felt some sort of pain. It's an internalization of the very debt structure. And for that, I think if we move further on, we're going to encounter what Nietzsche calls the bad conscience, the consciousness of guilt. And I think guilt is where we can say that the creditor-debtor relationship is not enough on its own. There needs to be a push towards the inside, the development of an inner world in which this creditor-debtor relationship is not something you can simply flee from.
And it's interesting because Nietzsche is being somewhat ironic in this passage here too. What he's doing is he's pushing the idea that, with the development of a system of measure, a system of comparison, a system of equivalence, one who internalizes this is then capable of making a distinction between those who are good creditors and those who are bad ones, those who are capable of entering into the right agreements, right? And so it's also a commentary not only on the system of contractarianism, but also of rights itself. And it makes me think that, what undergirds the notion of rights, of contract, is this very thing. It seems to me to be a commentary on Enlightenment values themselves. And it's interesting because when I was reading this section, I was thinking about how Jordan Peterson holds Friedrich Nietzsche in high regard. And I imagine that when Peterson read this section, he was actually valorizing the sovereign individual. This is the kind of person that Jordan Peterson's Nietzsche wants to be held in the highest regard. Somebody who is reliable, somebody who's responsible, somebody who's capable of making the right decisions within an already given moral framework.
Yeah, I also want to point out that Nietzsche's clearly pulling your leg a little bit when he's this master of free will.
Right.
That's not the kind of master Nietzsche's talking about, right? The master Nietzsche's talking about, even in the first essay of this book, is kind of not at all comparable to the kind of sovereign intellectual individual who is kind of burdened by the philosophy of modernity, conventional moral thought. To him, the sovereign is kind of a remarkably silly figure. It's not at all kind of a mastery in the Nietzschean sense. It's a mastery in the sense that one becomes a docile figure, right? It's a freedom, but it's a freedom based on docility. It's a funny passage.
It confuses morality and autonomy. That's the problem. He doesn't think morality and autonomy can ever be the same thing. But sorry, Craig, I interrupted.
The notion of free will that he's attacking here, he claims is a derivative of this system. The kind of free will that the person who wants free will gets is one that tries to extricate them from the system of deterministic relations that Nietzsche believes to be true. And what does free will allow? Well, it allows a validation of this system. It's the kind of self-legislation that is derived from internalizing the logic of the promise that he's critiquing here. Once you get this concept of free will, you can have the notion of a God who is pleased by one who makes the right kind of choices. It's ironic in the sense that the notion of free will doesn't serve the God per se, but it serves the notion of subjugation that comes with the creditor-debtor relationship.
It's in fact so much more powerful, right? Like, because what it allows us to say is that he could have chosen otherwise, right? It allows us to say that the cruel individual can be ripped from the almost Dionysian innocence and say that no, they actively choose and can choose and must choose otherwise. So in fact, it almost functions as powerfully without the armature of a conventional theology behind it. But that theology at the level of its legality, its liturgy, is so important. And
I found the role of violence in Nietzsche's discussion really interesting, and we haven't, I don't think, done so much about that yet. With what Craig was saying about deliberation and responsibility and so on, responsibility and promise keeping are some of the key themes here in this discussion. One of Nietzsche's arguments is that concepts which we would today take to be commonsensical and vital, like it's impossible to think of morality without them, like negligence, he says, accidental, whether someone is accountable. These kinds of ideas. These come much later. For Nietzsche, morality is not born out of moral reasonings where we come to a sort of view about accountability, let's say. The origins of morality are, as he says, bathed in blood. It's violence at the very start, which I think he says forces people to remember 3 or 4 I will nots. And that's kind of enough at the start, because it's this sort of physical inscription and the dealing out of pain in this sense, which etches that memory upon the bodies of those who have acted in ways that those, on the upper hand of this particular relation of power do not approve of. So that was one point I found interesting. And I mean, I know I've made a few comparisons already, but I mean, I think in section 3 of this essay, he discusses it through a number of examples, the ways in which this process has sort of expressed itself. I mean, he gives some pretty violent examples. He talks about the breaking on the wheel, throwing stakes, boiling the criminal in oil of wine, and then he says the popular flaying alive, carving flesh from the chest, and so on. With the help of such images and procedures, people finally retained 5, 6 I will nots in their memory with respect to that which they gave their promise in order to share in the advantages of society. I found that interesting for 2 reasons. One is that it's a kind of historical account of a particular relation of power at a particular point in our history. And it just occurred to me reading that it seems that Foucault's Discipline and Punish could be seen as a kind of continuation of that, a direct continuation, a sort of acknowledgement that maybe this was at the origins, but in what ways have things changed today? I mean, when you read, Nietzsche gives the example of people being flayed alive, carving flesh from the chest. Your mind kind of has to go to the opening lines or pages of Discipline and Punish, right, with Damien the regicide, right? So it seems to me there's both a parallel and a continuation, which we can probably see in Foucault's work about the notion of violence. And while I'm following this train of thought, maybe I'll just stick at it a little for a moment. For Nietzsche, there's this idea that cruelty has always been with us and perhaps always will. But it seems to me there's a sense for him that it's still with us, but it's found new forms. It's taken on new forms. Cruelty, where perhaps at a certain point it was recognized openly as cruelty, is perhaps now seen in other ways, disguised in other forms, particularly through religion, as he said, which he calls sort of unnecessarily cults of cruelty, right? And again, you could see the same parallel with Foucault. Foucault's the question of power is what forms does power take at a particular point in a particular time. So the parallel there is important on its own, but also just in itself, I think it's important to think about for Nietzsche the way that violence and cruelty structure both the origins of morality, but also continue to play that role as it continues. It takes on new forms for Nietzsche, but it doesn't necessarily go away. And he has this idea that perhaps in terms of violence and pain, it's perhaps even worse, he thinks, for what he calls the civilized or whatever, and it's new forms, but maybe it's sort of still with us. And maybe that I know Adam wanted to talk about festivity and so on. Maybe that's a good opportunity, but I don't know. Maybe we can stick with this for a little bit. We're only half an hour in, right?
Like the one thing I wanted to cut in is like we always see like discussions of like Klasowski's Nietzscheanism, Bataille's Nietzscheanism, Deleuze's Nietzscheanism, but like Foucault's Nietzscheanism is like a remarkably practical one, right? Like Foucault is going to say that like the fresh ideas that he finds on every page in Nietzsche, it's these violent like torturous cycles, right? That when Nietzsche's talking about how when one transcends the body of the creditor, how does that not immediately bring you to the body of the king? And in a sense, like all of the groundwork of what we're going to see in like these treatments of penality in the 20th century, they don't exist without this text. Like really, the most fundamental elements of the historical treatment that you find in like Discipline and Punish, the History of Sexuality, Volume 2 and 3, like they exist methodologically here. Like Foucault says as much. So when we talk about like, French Nietzscheanism, like it really like he really is an omnipresent figure, but he manifests in so many different ways. And for, Deleuze, it's going to be the interplay of forces. For Bataille, it's going to be a very particular treatment of cruelty. For Artaud, it's going to be a very particular treatment of cruelty. But then for Foucault, it is this like fundamental practical treatment of these festivities, these moments to show the power and strength and the wronged nature of the sovereign. That's the sovereign that was wronged.
And I think it's worth saying that a lot of what Matt and you, Will, were just talking about is what we mean by a genealogy, right? How is it, for example, that certain practices of punishment again and again, basically mushrooming into these, systems and institutions whereby at some point a certain maxim or axiom is conducted or rehearsed or recited as a way to institutionalize those sort of what I called earlier in our pre-discussion, like a death of 1,000 cuts that gets you to the point where you essentially institutionalize the practice of promising. At what point do those minor punishments stack up and turn over and become the creditor-debtor relationship? Well, it's with the installation of these maxims, I will, thou shalt not, when they become performative in a sense and institutionalized. And this is what Nietzsche says. He's like, this is the very basis of asceticism. And this is the basis of the valuation of values, where a value emerges to the exclusion of all others. One of the ways that making promises itself gets power is through the institution of particular moralities. If we can get people to feel guilty about transgressing certain moral maxims or sexual mores, well, then it shores up other kinds of powers to impose domination in other sorts of ways. So one of the functions of tribal councils, of churches and states and whatnot, is to systematize this tendency towards cruelty and thus institutionalize it.
I like that it becomes institutionalized, because I actually think like that's the trajectory of all of these things. Like it ends up in that malignant monster, that cold, what's the cold snake of the state, right? With all of its disturbing lies to Nietzsche. Like it just finds itself calcified there in a new form.
It sucks the festivity out of cruelty in a way. I mean, because he's thinking about cruelties within the pre-Christian mode at the time of the Greeks, and sort of jumping between these two time periods to show how out of his time in a way Artaud was. Artaud's most famous audio play is called "To Have Done with the Judgement of God," and in the Kaufman translation of this genealogy, he translates the idea of having an inability to be an active forgetter as someone who can never have done with anything. We need forgetting in order to not be continually obsessing in our consciousness, over every single little thing. It lives, rent free in our heads. and to have an active force of forgetting is to have done with the judgment of God. You can't have done with anything without this force of active forgetting. And what's interesting in the way he talks about the Greeks is that they actively forget various forms of what we would call notions of guilt and promising, and not simply in spite of the religious tendencies of the time. Rather, they transpose these so-called moral failings into their gods. Nietzsche says it pretty clearly. He says, if someone does something especially malicious, or what we would now call evil, it was common in the Greek times to say, oh, he or she was possessed, was possessed by a god. They exported their cruelties to them, and that gave them justifications for, in ways of entering into this contest of debtor and creditor and these plays of cruelty. I mean, that's the tragic element of their theatres, which they gave people prizes for. They were competitive forms of the practice of displaying these very festive kinds of cruelty everyone can get involved in. And I think it also plays into the idea of a pre-moral or at least underdeveloped moral sense in the Greeks when it comes to not simply having an idea of good and evil, but good and bad in the terms of arete, Aristotelian virtue ethics. How does this thing do itself well? And I think you can fit cruelty into this pre-moral mode of good and bad cruelty. There is a kind of a bad cruelty insofar as it cannot have done with anything. It's petty. It can never let anything go. It shows a kind of character that lacks the strength and self-moderation and self-control to let things pass by. It's almost like Zarathustra's ape in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And then there's a kind of good cruelty which really isn't hung up on every single thing, only ever exercises itself against a force is equal or even more that's worthy challenging it. And this is where really you get the ideas of justice and mercy within this creditor and debtor relationship for Nietzsche. Justice for him fundamentally is just at its origin this exchange. That which is borrowed shall be repaid, debts shall be paid. But justice really, insofar as it is a sort of this contest of powers, the accumulation of various kinds of powers, and this sort of strengthening of this competitive edge. Eventually, justice supersedes itself because not every debt needs to be repaid. Because otherwise, if you focus on every single debt, every single wrong, you could never have had done with them. You couldn't simply forget all the tiny things, and you'd be sort of displaying a kind of negative kind of strength, a lack of strength, insecurity. And this is, it's like you don't hunt down and kill every mosquito that takes blood from you. It's a bad form of cruelty. Good cruelty is actually mercy. It's the self-supersession or the self-overcoming in the Kaufman translation. But if we look into the German, it's Aufhebung. Just saying. It's good cruelty is merciful. Bad cruelty is petty.
But I mean, we could talk about the church being merciful. We can talk about a judge being merciful. So the question is not mercy in itself. This is what Nietzsche's asking us to investigate here. It's to be merciful for whom? Because over time, what the creditor-debtor relationship does, it allows the state, it allows the capitalist, it allows the judge to allocate for themselves the better part of the festivities. Right. And the function of a judge or judgment in this sort of broader sense, the function of justice for Nietzsche here is that it cuts us off from our ability to form alliances with different values, different powers, and different entities that might allow us to overcome the system of judgment itself. And so in that sense, I tend to go with the concept of alliance over that of mercy, of the joining with forces with whom I have sympathies, with whom I can create a collective enlivenment so that whether as individuals or as a collective assemblage or what have you, I can allocate for myself or for my team or for my collectivity, the greater part of surplus enjoyment.
Well, mercy involves forgetting. The problem is the church and the capitalists never forget.
That's right.
At least not intentionally. Sometimes it gets past them, but credit history, credit score. The church can forgive you your sins, but they can always bring them back later. It's the forgetting which shows that their mercy is never truly merciful.
The free individual is the individual that can give an account of oneself, right? That can give a biographical account of who they are, and like the very function of the name, right, is one that already entails a sort of indebtedness. So like the most free one can be is dependent on how much data they can maintain at any given time as a subject.
I suppose I had a question about mercy in a way, because, and it may be that I just need to read more Nietzsche or more about Nietzsche, do my homework, right? But Nietzsche seems to have this almost, am I wrong in thinking he has a sort of ambivalent sort of position on the idea of mercy? So there's this passage I was sort of going back to and reading sort of over and over again, and he writes that a consciousness of power in society could be imagined according to which society would afford itself the noblest luxury available to it, that of letting its offender go unpunished. And then he says so may they, what do I care about my parasites, it might say then. May they live and prosper, I'm still strong enough for that. And he says, this ends up with looking the other way and allowing the one who is incapable of pain to go free. It ends, like every good thing on earth, by sublating itself, this self-sublation of justice. We know by that what beautiful name it calls itself, mercy. But then he, in a final sentence, he says, it remains as a self-evident, the prerogative of the most powerful, or better yet, his beyond the law. And so for me, there's an ambivalence there. I mean, it's possible that this is something he has like this obvious answer, mercy sucks, somewhere else. But when I read it there, on the one hand, it sounds like he sort of thinks there might be something in it which at least helps us stop dwelling on the wrongs that have been committed against us, right?
There's a strength, though, that he ascribes to that society, right? It's like, let the parasites be.
Yeah, exactly.
The brilliance of this new mechanism is like, no, like the function of the aesthetic ideal is to ensure that cruelty's meted out inwards at all times. Right?
Yeah.
That's the malignant function of this.
Like, on the one hand, it's obvious that Nietzsche has a real problem with the idea of pity, of course, and these are close but slightly distinct concepts, right? But at least when I read that passage, it seems that there's more of an ambivalent perspective. On the one hand, it may perform a kind of positive role if what mercy does is constitute a kind of forgetfulness, a kind of retrieval of that power of forgetfulness, to let things go and to not obsess over what it is that we're owed and exacting revenge. And when we're incapable of doing that, we turn that, anger and resentment inwards and so on. But on the other hand, as he says, it says in that final sentence, mercy, it remains, as is self-evident, the prerogative of the most powerful, or better yet, his beyond the law. So there's a sense for Nietzsche as well, that on the other hand, mercy it's the prerogative of rich, as he says. It's or the powerful. It's this thing which it's almost it is an exercise of power, right? It's power allowing itself the permission to not be exercised in this occasion, right? So am I wrong there? Like, does someone else?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I wanted to just make one point about the beginning of the passage you read. The use of the word noble there is really important. Yeah. Right? Because when he's talking about the individuals who he has at least some sympathies for in the first essay, it's going to be those of the noble disposition, right? In nobility. So that's a Sudi kind of pseudo-philological comment, because I'll need to know what the actual translation is. But I think it's important to state to just point out that he's not just using powerful or masterful, but noble.
Yeah.
I mean, just to conclude some stuff on this mercy. I think mercy, in a sense, is not 10 Hail Marys and a fiver in the box kind of thing. It's not actually as in what we call intentional, or doesn't make a grand declaration of itself. I give mercy. It can do that in the sense of, I don't really care, but really it's kind of, it's almost like a reflex. It's like a reflex, because Nietzsche's entire thing is about health, and for better or worse, the historical breeding of certain people. And yeah, but essentially, a person who is well developed enough to have those kinds of powers mercy would be kind of it would be a reflex, because their memory, their functions of collecting things and remembering them, would be trained such that they wouldn't remember stuff that was essentially below them, below their power, something that would not be very conducive to the development of the powers of that person themselves. They just wouldn't care. It wouldn't even linger.
I think between Adam and I right now, there's really just a verbal dispute more than anything else. And I would add to Adam's explanation there, well, two things. One is, if we, in any act of, whether we call it forgiveness or forgetfulness, if we accord to ourselves any virtue in whatever sort of performative act we engage in, well, then clearly it's not forgetting. Right? We're extracting a surplus. We're wearing that pin or that medal that says, I am the virtuous one for having done this. And I mean, this happens in so many, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously. There are two good quick anecdotes that I can offer here. I'm thinking of the Zen master Shunryu Suzuki, who wrote the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, has an interesting passage in there that says, in anything that you do, be sure to burn yourself up and leave no trace in what it is that you do. And the concept of a trace here is important. Imagine in any action that we take that we don't leave that trace. And what is a trace? A trace is a memory, whether it's in the accordance of virtue to ourselves, or remembering an event, or having a vendetta against whomever it was that wronged us. To be able to have some sort of psychological function that allows us to process or eliminate that trace within us, well, then that would be an act of forgetting. There's also another Zen monk whose name is Ryokan, and I posted this book on Twitter. There's a famous story where he's on a boat, and Ryokan the monk was known for being a very vibrant, lively, almost childlike individual. And one day this fisherman had him out on a boat, and he got kind of annoyed with, this guy over here, he's never made to feel unhappy. He's always alive, buoyant, whatever. And then what the fisherman decides to do is I'm going to get this guy. So what he does is he rocks the boat and sends the monk flying into the water. Now, the monk's in the water. He's screaming for his life. Help me, please save me. And then the fisherman's like, oh my gosh, what did I just do? Let me just pull this guy out. So he pulls him out of the water, and Ryokan immediately says, oh my gosh, thank you so much for saving my life. Right? After having been thrown in the water and knowing that this guy had thrown him into the water on purpose. I take Ryokan's example as being someone whose faculty of active forgetting has outstripped their ability to produce a memory and dwell upon it and seek vengeance. And I mean, I'm not saying that's exactly what Nietzsche is envisioning here, but the two examples that I tried to bring in with the Zen monks, I think are somewhat akin to what Nietzsche's going for.
Yeah, and I guess I wanted to say one last thing, just because on my idea of mercy, because I know that the idea that there might be a place for mercy in a reading of Nietzsche is a very, very strange one. And I'm not sure exactly how it would work out either. It's just, when you read that passage, I think it's thought-provoking regardless, I think. This notion of, on one hand, forgetfulness, maybe there's more of a place for that, for letting things go, in a certain way. But more broadly, there's a methodological problem with that reading, which is that presumably the whole reason he's writing this is that you think this book is that we've forgotten so much, right? That the origins of morals, of morality, are drenched in blood, and that, we don't remember this anymore, and we think of it in this very strange way for Nietzsche. So I'm not saying that my reading there is, absolutely correct. But I think it's an interesting way of looking at it, because it seems like you could draw a distinction there from something like pity as well, because pity also expresses certain different affects, and in particular, it has a different relation to power. Perhaps one reason why Nietzsche seems a little ambivalent on this point in this passage is that he seems to expressly consider mercy an expression of powers capacity for non-expression, if you see what I mean. But but in this instance, it chooses not to intervene, but could, right?
No, I think that's a fine interpretation of a society that it just fundamentally has like a completely alien organization of power. I don't know if Nietzsche's necessarily going to have like a problem with the individual's choice of letting go, because like when it comes to the individual, Nietzsche doesn't necessarily have a problem with the individual taking pleasure in the pain of someone else, right? Like you could come away with that misinterpretation in this text and think like he thinks that it's like sick to take pleasure in that, but it's not. And in the same way, there is that, I think, still a somewhat valid open question regarding what you brought up.
One of the problems that Nietzsche has with the notion of pity that might apply to our discussion here of mercy or anything else that we're talking about is that in any given instant, the pitier, when pitying the pitiable, presupposes within themselves that they have somehow extricated themselves from the possibility or the immediacy of the totality of life, which encompasses all pleasure and all pain at any given time. And I think that's one of the things here. It cuts this hard distinction between the person who suffers and the person who witnesses the suffering. Right. And this is one of the things that Nietzsche's trying to explode and going beyond the creditor-debtor relationship.
Yeah. And of course, he's also unhappy with any view which centers suffering in the first place, right? Or at least centers it as this negative value. It's why, in a strange way, perhaps strange for some people reading Nietzsche, he's sort of quite resolutely anti-hedonistic as well. He's going to actively and decisively reject a view which takes suffering to be a negative value. Suffering for Nietzsche can be a source of profound importance and value for us. And so he takes a quite different view of that, right?
I mean, Dionysus affirms all, right? That's the whole point. That is why I think like people who argue that like Birth of Tragedy, of course, there are fundamental breaks in Nietzsche's development, but the Dionysian, the most fundamental element there is the affirmation of life as such. No qualifications, no redirection. There is this unity of all encompassing life that Nietzsche sees slowly with, whether it be Plato and Euripides or Kant and Spinoza, constantly being thwarted by developments philosophically and culturally.
Okay, maybe one of the last things that we'll talk about is Nietzsche's notion of conscience, particularly bad conscience. And there's some other items in there that we want to unpack a little bit, especially conscience's relationship to ancestor worship and so forth. Adam, we were discussing that earlier. Maybe you can explain.
So why does Nietzsche want an idea of conscience? For the sovereign individual, for this highest point of promising as it's developed, its conscience is the only thing that motivates it. Its internal drive towards feeling bad when it doesn't get its promises, but always trying to do so, powering itself forward alongside the moral ways of thinking that regulate promising. Now, okay, how do we get this? Well, it's something internal. How do we get this internal element? How does it develop? How does it grow throughout history and from prehistory to now? In order to understand this, Nietzsche takes us back to the creditor and debtor relationship and how it functions socially, in terms of how the creditor-debtor relationship becomes institutionalized, as we were talking about, into the state, and into the idea that the state itself is something you could be owed to. The social body has a kind of credit and debt system working inside of it. And originally this works out in terms of ancestor worship. The people that built the state which you enjoy living in, the benefits of this community are upheld by the blood of the forefathers. Or foreparents. It wasn't always. All societies have been patriarchal, and it's this idea of debt to the ancestor, and that grows throughout sociality. And as societies, if society survives and it gets even stronger and stronger and stronger, well, then They've had it lasts longer, more people have died from it, more people have worked to improve it. The debt to the ancestor, the creator's debt, really expands until you get to the idea of deification of the ancestor, owing things to these gods who have created everything you know of in your social world, your life world, your Umwelt in sort of the environment sense in German. And this is where the genius of something like Christianity comes in. Because eventually you can keep distilling these ancestors into the idea of the creator themselves. And this is where we get to the idea of good versus evil coming in from the first essay. Where Christianity comes in is it brings forth the idea of infinite debt to the creator. Okay, this hasn't really given us that yet. All infinite debt has to be redeemed by Christ's blood, which he can probably take away any time, given he's omnipresent. But where this internalization hasn't quite come about yet. What we have so far is the conditions for it. And given in society, cruelty is gradually more and more less socially acceptable because it's more disruptive, and power has become more abstracted in the forms of institutions of state and law, these festive impulses, these ravenous Dionysian impulses, these abilities to extract cruelty from people who have wronged you immediately, even just simply to beat someone up who has done something that hurt you in a way, he's completely gone. This is where the big Freudian twist comes, because it's very funny. In the Kaufman translation, Freud is like sort of see Freud to see how this develops. The forces that cannot be externalized only have one place to go, and they turn inwards, and they play amongst themselves, and they sort of keep punching against this very thin residuum of the inner world of the subject inside the human being, and they sort of develop it in terms of this huge inner world of conflicts and internalized debts, things that couldn't quite be forgotten, but that couldn't quite be finished in terms of their realization in cruelty. And this develops this entire inner world of internalized debt. Now, if you throw Christianity into this, after this socialization process, we've developed this internal organ of the conscience, of the internalization of debt, which becomes guilt. Bam, you've got bad conscience there. You've got a theology that makes you indebted to God forever, a God who can never forget. And you've got an internal organization, an internal world, which, if anything, controls you more than the external world does in that sense. These forces, the social world has become the inner world, and the inner world has become an overbearing pain at the fact that you can never repay God for what he's done for you. You live in original sin. And this is where the entire system of control intervenes into the mere system of debt and justice and turns it into the moral notion that you are responsible for so many things and you have to keep your promises. Otherwise, you will fall back upon the original debt. It's fundamentally an unhappy consciousness, in Hegel's sense, of the sense of contradiction between the world as someone who has the responsibility to pay back your debts, but the debts can never be truly be paid. And that's a bad conscience.
But they both can and must, but also cannot.
Exactly.
And it's infinitized on three fronts. The first is the infinity of obligation. Like you said, Adam, we can never pay off this debt. The infinity of measurement, in the sense of we as human beings are unable to measure or calculate in the same way that God can. And the suffering of existential guilt in perpetuity, given the fact that we always fall short of the perfect standards that are imposed upon us, and the suffering of this obligation does not terminate until we are dead and receive judgment.
And in a sense, too, that's what I wanted to. So we're talking about all of these notions of there is no distinct origin, in Nietzsche's genealogy for all of these. It's always a convalescing of all of these various forces coming together to create a moment in which bad conscience can manifest. It doesn't have there's not one particular trajectory or institution that allows the bad conscience or ressentiment or the ascetic ideal to manifest. It's all of these forces coming together.
It's a sedimentation when viewed historically. It's layers of sediment, one built on top of the other, each of which being the sort of the conclusion of a certain conflict, a certain resolution of power in that moment.
Yeah, to steal a term, I guess, from Deleuze, maybe it's somewhere else, but it's geophilosophical.
Also, maybe even to use Guattari, we can talk about it in terms of semiotics, redundancies and resonances. I mean, think about every day going to school as a young boy, saying the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Doubling down day after day on your obligation to the state. And so, and then, to kind of mix metaphors here with Matt, yes, that does then involve a kind of sedimentation process of those values.
There's stuff that I wanted to sort of get into regarding the very end of this essay in the genealogy, where he talks about how there needs to be this Antichrist, this anti-nihilist, this conqueror of God and of nothingness. He must come one day. And, he's very clearly like, who is the person who in a sense, the person who is going to, I'm going to use this term in its like most casual way, transcend all of this, must go over it, right? Like he can't be someone who dwells on it, who battles against it directly. He must just bite its head off and go over it. So, who is going to, in a sense, like the Übermensch as a figure is someone who must engage in an active forgetting of all of these things. And there's this figure in Nietzsche's Zarathustra who there's this snake who has their fangs just absolutely embedded in the throat of this individual, and he's pulling at it and pulling at it and pulling at it, and Zarathustra's there just saying, no, just bite off its head. And instead of pulling at the snake, he just bites down on it until it's dead, and what is left is this kind of terrifying laughter, the laughter of the Übermensch. One day we'll do something on Zarathustra, but that's why I think he ends with enough, because Nietzsche needs to deliver this figure who can then deliver the doctrine of the eternal return, right? Which Craig described the stakes so importantly of in order for there to be a creditor and a debtor, right? There needs to both be a delineated linear past and a delineated teleological future within which you pay that debt. On the other hand, there needs to also be this figure of the Übermensch who can recognize the truth, the supposed cosmological truth of the eternal return, and begin to actively forget and affirm the will to power in this way.
The sort of epilogue to this episode involves talking about, or at least just mentioning, what is Nietzsche in praxis? How has it developed, not only in Nietzsche, but in other philosophers as well? I mean, one way, and maybe this can sort of forecast future episode ideas. I know we'll be talking about at some point the conjuncture of James Hillman and Deleuze. I'm in talks with somebody right now to do that episode, and just psychoanalysis, Jungian analysis, and seeing how that kind of work, dream work or inner work, as it has been called, is a way to sort of work on and operate on these feelings in a sort of clinical setting. But beyond that, there's the politics too, right? Looking at Bataille, transgression, looking at Deleuze, among many things, becoming imperceptible, becoming child, becoming woman. And
don't you dare forget Foucault.
Oops. Yeah. And then who? But yeah, of course, Foucault too. What it comes down to for Nietzsche, at least one of the things, is something we've talked about here quite a bit, which is seizing the means of subjectivation. What does that mean? That's the sort of broad program here. It could mean, seizing an affect. It could mean, sort of raging against that impulse in you to obey your masters, when it matters the most, right? Amongst other things. But I digress.
I've got an idea of what it means. Because Nietzsche keeps talking about this metaphor of pregnancy, and it's about this inner world of the bad conscience, which is, it has so much potential, because if you coupled it with a sort of a master's level of power and self-affirmative power, coupled with this inner world, which is so far, has an amazing creative and artistic potential for the artisanship of cruelty, to make to make the tragedy of Greece one person long, in a way, It's all about externalizing. It's about seizing this and externalizing and then redirecting it outwards to overcome the forces of repression. It's a kenotic externalization. It's an expenditure, really. It's a pure expenditure rather than keeping your, essentially, just both a child and shit kept inside you all this time since the birth of Christianity. And applying these creative skills just without, almost not quite without restraint, but with the discipline that it takes to construct an entire new edifice of the social whole. And this is where I think it comes into the eternal return, because the eternal return has nothing to do with consciousness. Because the recurrence of consciousness is not the continuation of consciousness. If it was about if it was about my conscious experiences repeating eternally, I feel sorry for the guy that has to feel them repeat. But I'm not. It's just going to be once for me. The eternal return is about the creative brief of an eternity. So, okay, everything you do now is going to shape the entirety of eternity forever. Okay, if you had that creative brief, how would you respond to it? How would you be the artisan of your own cruelty? And how would you seize the means of eternity itself?
Why did we have to open up the ethics of the eternal return?
Well, I can put a fine point on it at the end, and I think Adam will appreciate this, because what we're talking about here is developing a praxis. And we don't want to, we need to satisfy the Marxists, so it has to be sufficiently materialist. Right. But at the same time,
we do not.
I think this chapter's already established that Nietzsche is clearly an economic reductionist, right?
He is, of libidinal economy for sure. And that goes hand in hand with the point that I was just about to make, which is that we would do well to expropriate the festival or the means of creating the festival to escape those processes which derogate us as subjects under domination, under capitalism, so forth.
I've got a final thought just before we wrap up, which is that obviously there's a whole range of things that this chapter is going to make anyone who reads it, think about. It provokes us to think about a lot of things. But one of the areas that I think it's perhaps most interesting and useful to think through is how Nietzsche's analysis in this essay can and should inform the way we think about the law, in particular, about the state. Because for Nietzsche, man is not born moral, right? It's power constructs humans and produces them as moral agents capable of being moral. So it essentially creates the subjects or subjectivities that it can then exercise power over in this new way. And for Nietzsche, obviously this is bound up in the notion of the promise, and the notion of a promise obviously underpins the possibility of morality, but it also underwrites and enables a possibility of law as well, right? And these two, of course, are intimately interwoven for Nietzsche. So on the one hand, we can talk about the creditor-debtor relationship at the root of this, but that takes the form of a contract. And so insofar as morality grants a certain like an air of legitimacy to law, insofar as law becomes a particular exercise of morality and power. And in the same way, this contractual character of it imbues morality with a law-like and contract-like character of its own. And so I think there's at least one reference to this directly to Kant in this essay. Nietzsche thinks it's therefore not a coincidence that morality also takes on this same contractual character of the sovereign individual. We can even see that in the development of Western Enlightenment thought. So what I wanted to say was really that there's a lot in this chapter which we should all, I think, be bringing to bear and thinking about the relation between morality and law in particular, and the ways in which power is exercised in both, but also the ways in which they reinforce each other. And I think Nietzsche is a really good way to get started on that sort of question, I think
one place to look for that is actually in Deleuze's book on Kant, where he talks about the evolution of law from Plato through Kant and even through Kafka. But we'll save that for another time. Thanks again for listening. Go ahead and connect with us on Patreon, become a supporter, or connect with us on Twitter or Instagram. On our next episode, we will have guest Dr. Gregory Sadler of Gregory Sadler fame join us to talk about Nick Land's Fanged Noumena and several essays in that book. We look forward to our date with Dr. Sadler, and we hope that you join us then. Okay, take care.